Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1255th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Monira Al Qadiri and Murtaza Vali. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Monira Al Qadiri is a Kuwait artist whose practice explores global histories, ecologies, and cultural narratives. Raised between cultures and educated in Japan, where she earned a Ph.D. in Intermedia Art from Tokyo University of the Arts, Al Qadiri's work primarily focuses on the worldwide impact of natural resource extraction. Through a combination of in-depth research and humor in her sculpture, videos, and installations, she brings to the fore the effects of what she refers to as petro-culture, a society shaped by and reliant on oil consumption. And our host today, Murtaza Vali, is a critic, curator, and art historian based in Brooklyn and Sharjah. He regularly contributes to various art periodicals and to books and exhibition catalogs published by both nonprofit institutions and commercial galleries. And with that, I will hand it over to Murtaza to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I just want to start off by thanking everybody at the Brooklyn Rail, Magali and Chloe, especially because they're the ones I've been communicating with for this lovely invitation. It's great to always be in conversation with Munira. Uh, Luckily, we get to do this every few years, but it's a dialogue that goes back more than a year, more than a decade, to when I um, saw some of Munira's earliest works around what she calls petro-culture. Um, and then we were lucky enough to collaborate on an exhibition that I did at the Jameel Art Center in 2018 called Crude, which was looking at modernity, oil and modernity, and its manifestations um, through art across West Asia. And as I mentioned, we've had a few opportunities to be in dialogue, either through writing, through exhibitions, through conversations such as this one since. Um, so I'm hoping that we'll get an acquaintance with Munira's work will happen gradually through the conversation for those who are not familiar with it as we speak about the work. So I'm not going to preempt it by giving you a introduction. And so I just thought we would start off with a very general question. Um, and one other thing I should mention is that Munira and I also do share a home in the Gulf. She is originally from Kuwait. I was born and raised in the United Arab Emirates in Sharjah. And so I think our twin interests also emerged from our childhoods, our shared childhoods, although a few thousand kilometers apart. Um, of growing up in these petro states or these petro cultures, like immersed in oil in one sense, but also completely unaware of its influence or of its effects in another sense. And hopefully we'll discuss that a little bit. So I just wanted to start off by asking, how did you first get interested in the topic of oil? The subject is it's quite vast, complex, and urgent, and artwork addressing it, is quite multifaceted. So how did you first get interested, and how would you say that how would you describe your particular take on the subject?
First of all, it's lovely to speaking with you again, Murtaza, and thanks for everyone at the Rail for having me today. I think my interest started really as a child. I was 7 years old when the Gulf War happened in Kuwait, and 700 oil wells were lit on fire, and we were living in this kind of environment where there was burning oil everywhere, and the sky was black and the earth was black and it was raining black rain and the sea was black. And I think as people from that region, we don't really think about oil so much. It's very kind of almost like a metaphysical, like a magic potion that's like in the background of life that makes everybody magically wealthy.
Mm,
But during this time, it was a physical substance in front of us. We were like almost covered in it for almost 2 years, I would say. And as a child, you don't really have a sense of right and wrong, right? It's just, I mean, even this insane like environmental destruction, for me really was a strange, sublime experience. These fires and the colors and the sky turning black during the day, for me as a child was fascinating. It's interesting how kids have a very different idea of the world, and everything can be fascinating, even though it's, horrible and destructive. So I still have that sense of fascination from that time. And I think it took me many years to kind of revisit that period in my life and really deal with it almost like, I felt like oil is almost like an alien or like from outer space that has kind of invaded our world and refuses to leave. It's almost like a genie that
Mm,
transforms into so many different guises. And so, yeah, it started there and it never stopped really.
okay.
Mhm.
How would you say that you characterize your approach to the subject? And of course, through the conversation,
Mhm.
we will see the multiple ways in which you've addressed the same subject. I mean, one of the reasons why I think we keep reconnecting for conversations, and one thing that I'm also always surprised by your work is how you keep finding different ways to kind of approach this topic. That the diversity, the variety, the imagination is quite breathtaking. But I was wondering if you could characterize if there is anything at the outset that kind of like characterizes your particular take on it, or um, whether you'd rather just get into speaking about the work.
No, I mean, I also see it as a kind of, as a self-portrait, I make these works around the oil, but I feel like they're emblematic of my generation, which I feel like is this freak generation in history that won't be lasting very long. And I feel like, I mean, the oil itself, I feel like is a freak interval in history, right? It's not going to continue very long. So I'm almost trying to kind of like create forms and shapes and colors that kind of yeah, symbolize this time in the history of the world, but also eulogize it in a way because I'm always thinking about the end of it.
Mm,
So for me, it's always like looking at it as if it's something from a long lost past, So
mm,
it's yeah, and there's so many different facets to it. Every time I'm researching something, I go into kind of a different tangent, and it's always evolving. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, no, I think the symbolic or the iconographic is a very important quality of your work. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the types of symbols that you come up with to kind of like come back, take us back to address this kind of like issue or crisis around oil. And there is this marked symbolism, like it's a very strong through line through the work. Um, so some of your earliest works, I think the first work, which was a monumental sculpture called Alien Technology, um, that was commissioned for and presented in 2014 at a in one of Dubai's historic neighborhoods. Uh, a lot of those early works, they kind of draw on oil infrastructure, which is so absolutely vital to its extraction. But like so many things around oil, remains kind of like invisible and elusive and inaccessible to us. But those early works kind of brought it to the fore and kind of gave it um, a presence within our visual fields. In those early works, you zoomed in on a very specific detail, which was namely the heads of the drills used to tap subterranean oil deposits. Magli, if you could just stop here for with the slideshow. And what's fascinating about this is like if you visit an oil museum, and there are a few of them, the one that I happened to visit was in Stavanger in Norway, which is the Norway's oil city. It's the city through which a large part of Norway's North Sea oil industry kind of spreads out. And in that museum, there's tons of these drill heads just sitting around, and they take all these different forms. So I just wanted to ask you what specifically drew you to this particular technology or this particular part of the infrastructural network. And if you could also speak about some of your first kind of iterations of it.
Yeah, I mean, going back to kind of the subject of self-portrait, I was really like, my work is very biographical. So it was really like after living 10 years in Japan, I went, I was studying there. I went back to Kuwait in 2010, very much kind of having this kind of identity crisis about who am I and culturally, what am I also? What's my history? And I also, I think, inherited this idea from being in Japan for so long, which is this, this idea of ancestors, and this, they call it the cult of ancestor worship, where, you would have like a small shrine at your home with your grandfather's picture, and you would speak to him and give him food and stuff. And in Kuwait, it's really this kind of idea does not exist, and strangely enough, like I went back to Kuwait and I really started thinking about my grandfather. And he died before I was born, but he was a singer on a pearl diving boat because before oil in Kuwait and Qatar and the UAE and Eastern Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, of course, the main industry before oil was pearl diving, and that continued for thousands of years. And then oil came and suddenly that doesn't exist anymore. So I really started thinking about him, and all of our public monuments in kind of public space are always like to do with pearls and pearl diving boats and things like this. And I always felt this sense of alienation from this history because I don't know anything about it. It's almost like a fiction or even like a cartoon even. I couldn't believe that he spent 6 months in the seas singing for divers. I just didn't understand this reality. And
Mm,
then I had this epiphany one day that actually pearls and oil have the same color scheme. It's this iridescent color that changes with the light. It's just on lighter and darker sides of the spectrum. So I thought this is the color of history of the Gulf. It's the pre-oil history, it is the post-oil history, but maybe it will change into something else in the future. So I started researching what should I coat this color with, and then I discovered the drill bits. They're just really phantasmagorical, bizarre things that look like pieces of jewelry because they're covered in gold and diamonds to be able to drill better.
mm,
And they really have this phantasmagorical shapes. There's so many hundreds, thousands of them, right? So I just started. The first one was the one I did in 2014 to alien technology. And it was in this heritage village, which was very interesting because it was placed next to a pearl diving boat. So almost like my dream came true. Like if the boat is my grandfather, then the drill is me.
mm,
And it is a very freakish, strange, form covered in this very crazy colors. But I thought that was perfect of like this kind of freakish kind of rupture in history that oil caused. It is this mutant somehow.
mm,
But in a way, they coexist in the same space in harmony.
mm.
So that's how I started, really.
One little historical tidbit that might be of interest, and is also kind of a coincidence, is that the rise of the cultured pearl industry in Japan was what actually brought the age of pearl in the Gulf to an end, because
Yeah.
yeah, the price of pearls fell quite dramatically. Um,
Exactly. It's so interesting also that, yeah, the man who discovered how to kind of grow pearls, basically, Mr. Mikimoto, he's always featured in our history books as kind of the villain. Destroyed the global pearl industry. But in Japan, he's just a, entrepreneur of business, like in the early 20th century, and he's kind of like a national hero. So
yeah.
it's so interesting how, these things histories are intertwined in very different ways.
Yeah, and I think this body of work, although it's a later body of work, I think synthesizes that early link between pearl and oil really well. I mean, they're basically these drill heads. The work that we're seeing on the screen right now, spectral pearl bud, um, but they're coated in something that looks very little, literally like pearlescent. But in
I
other
think we can
works,
go to the next slide, Magli.
oh yeah, sorry. Oh yeah. So but you've actually used a whole variety of like a spectrum to refer to the name of the work of the name that this body of work often has. Um, in in other works that you've done of the same type or the same series. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the paint and the color schemes, if they have some other particular references. Um,
Um, yeah, the paints, I mean, I just researched how to kind of find these iridescent paints. I really wanted something that shifts color with the lights, you know? I mean, the interesting thing about pearls is that they're just, they're just like bacteria that infected a shell, and the shell tries to protect itself and secretes this, liquid that makes this hard oval object. And the only reason people thought they were beautiful is because they trick your eye. You know, you can
mm,
never get the same color twice. And I started kind of thinking that that's also kind of the allegory that is existing in oil as well. I mean, it is this kind of rainbow-like strange substance that is tricking us, into this ideas of convenience and wealth and speed, in our
mm.
societies. But at the same time, it's destroying us, and it's interesting. This idea of trickery is very important, I think, in my work. Mm.
I think you mentioned speed, and I think what I was trying to get at was also the fact that this type of paint is very commonly used in custom car cultures,
Exactly.
the automotive industry. So if you notice the captions all make a point of saying automotive paint. So there is this kind of like explicit link that you're drawing, or material link that you're drawing between the oil industry and the automobile industry, which, of course, as we all know, are uh,
Yeah.
very linked throughout the 20th century, although maybe not moving into the future. But yeah, and a lot of the cities and the landscape in the Gulf is very much driven on one hand by oil and on the other hand by cars. So you have very little public transport. You have long highways. There's this idea that everyone's going to use cars, and in some sense, they are basically these urban forms that oil produced. It was because of a wealth of oil, and also because oil could be subsidized early on, that there is this high use of car culture there, and also the reason why the cities are kind of like oriented around cars.
Mhm.
Magli, if you could move on to the next. If you could speak a little bit about these. So they're the similar drill heads, but rather than being installed like portraits into the wall, they kind of do a little something else.
Yes, they actually levitate in midair. So, when I was making my earlier works, let's say, the small drills, and I was painting them with this, actually, like you said, these hot rod car paints, they're actually very sophisticated and really have this amazing technology that contain these tiny crystals that basically, if you look at from different angles, have a different color.
Mm,
And they develop all these paints all the time, right, for motorcycles and cars and stuff. But it's interesting also in that industry that you can't really get these paints everywhere because it depends how adventurous people are with their car color tastes. So in the Gulf, they're very prevalent. You can find all these incredible colors. But for example, when I was living in the Netherlands, people didn't really like it. So so I couldn't find the paints that I needed. But when I was painting them, the drills, I discovered that they actually have these very, or almost organic like shapes, right? I mean, they're made to get earth out of, ground out of the earth. And so they have these, I mean, when they move, like when I spin them to paint them, they would really like almost look like hands or like animals or something.
mm,
And so I just, I always say the story, but I had a dream that night that in the future we had too much clean energy instead of drilling the earth, the drills would be drilling the sky. And so the next day I woke up and I just thought about how am I going to make this happen? And I was actually living in Amsterdam at the time and walked by the store that sold these crazy magnetic machines and started working with these magnets to make them levitate. And they just spin in the air almost like they're, drilling nothingness. But really, when you put them on these pedestals and they're levitating and they have these shapes and colors, and I mean, it really looks like, the Tower of Babel or some crazy
mm.
architecture picture or, Viking helmet. You don't even know what it is, right? It's just
Or Dubai or Doha.
yeah, exactly. So they really have this amazing yeah, they a magical kind of effect added to this idea of, what is oil, what is, the inner mechanics of this industry are almost like a superstitious kind of magic alien world that we don't understand. So
Yeah,
this is
some scholars have called that capacity of oil. They've used the phrase petro magic. And this is the wonderful thing. Once you get involved in this like sphere of petro-culture, you realize that you can add petro to almost anything and make a neologism.
yeah.
But yeah, I was quite struck by when I was trying to think about how one writes about these works. There is this really interesting shift that where they go from portrait to monument when you kind of shift their orientation by 90 degrees and have them point towards the sky. And these Gulf cities like Doha, Dubai, Riyadh, Kuwait City, um, they are all they're kind of like these. They're these like magical like vertical formations that are entirely based on oil. But there was one detail in actually one of the texts that in the Peritin exhibition, which the text I thought were really wonderfully written, that talks about how this kind of like levitation quality or this kind of like space between the top of the pedestal and the bottom of the sculpture also kind of mimics an edifice that's built on nothing or built on loose sand, which I think is also like another interesting metaphor for Gulf cities in a way. Um, um,
Exactly. I mean, I feel like it's almost like it's an expression of fragility as well. They look
yeah,
so monumental and amazing when they're floating in the air, but if you touch them, they will fall down and break. And there is this idea of like this very fragile kind of illusion of grandiosity that we're living in.
yeah. And if people have not had a chance to see the show, I would say that just spending a little bit of time with these objects is worth the trip alone. They're quite fascinating, and when we exhibited them in crude, we had to make sure that we kept a certain amount of distance and put up like one of those velvet ropes, which I really don't like because people and me included when I was putting it up, I kept wanting to like run my hand in between that empty space. Magli, if you can move on to the next slide. So your engagement with the oil's infrastructure hasn't been limited to the drill bit. It's taken many different forms. I mean, you've also used sort of underground visualization studies that have been produced. The drill bits have been translated into like so many different materials that I'm I'm flabbergasted sometimes, all the way from like um, glass and then also carved into pearls, the forms. But this is a slightly different part of like oil's infrastructural network. So if you could talk to us about these and explain what the origins of them are and how you kind of translated this piece of oil technology, extractive technology into artworks.
So, I mean, it's just delving into kind of different sides of the inner mechanics of the industry, right? It's so massive and large and intricate, and I think beyond the human scope of imagination. So I always try to find these, strange objects or machines or tools that we don't really know about and try to bring them up in different ways. This is a series called Nawa. Maybe go to the next slide, which means rope in Japanese, but also is the letters for rope in ancient Egyptian, actually. Um, and so there's these very intricate kind of metal cables that are used to kind of bring the oil out of the earth. Um, and if you cut them into these cross sections, they look like very intricate, beautiful flowers. So I decided to make this kind of iridescent flower garden almost. It's almost like the Garden of Eden, where, there is this poison apple waiting for us to to lure us towards our doom.
Yeah.
And so I've turned this into kind of a different series of works. Yeah.
Magli, you can go to the next slide too. Yeah, I mean, I've always found the floral to be an interesting reference. It goes back to some of some of the works we included at Crude also were these very large drill bits that were installed in the wall like spectrum, but were monumental in scale. And in that, the floral was a very, very strong reference, and I think it also comes through with Nava. Um, but moving on, so a few years ago, there was kind of like a very important expansion, shall we say, in both subject and scale in your work, and a shift from the infrastructural to the molecular. And the petrochemical industry is a very important part of the petro-industrial complex. It's only through the distillation and refinement of crude oil that, in my opinion, oil manages to exert its most profound and perhaps most pernicious influence, which is the way in which it has penetrated so many aspects of our lives beyond energy. Um, the chemicals that are derived from petrochemical processes are used to produce so many others, completely shifted our material universe, our chromatic universe, just to mention two. They're best known as in plastics and synthetic fabrics. But petro derivatives are also used in the cosmetics industry. They also come into processed food and sometimes can serve as early building blocks for pharmaceuticals as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this shift. It's not really a shift because all of these lines of inquiry are kind of like happening simultaneously. Um, but yeah, an expansion might be a better way of talking about it. And there was an expansion in scale. I mean, there's always been monumentality in your work, but some of these earliest forays in this line of inquiry were quite large, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to make these extra large works also to make them feel more oppressive in space. Because the idea was, I mean, when I really started thinking about, we always think about oil in terms of fuel, right? We always think about it in energy terms. But I mean, the petrochemical industry is, I mean, it's beyond like the different transformations of this ancient liquid to all these different things is, I mean, mind-boggling. At some point I was thinking, I even wear it on my body. It's
Mm,
polyester, it's shampoo, it's like we have an intimate, like even physical relationship with it. And so many people I feel like want to distance themselves from this material and want to kind of think of it, oh, it's something that's happening in the Middle East or something. It's really so pervasive in our lives, in our daily lives, in so
mm,
many different ways that are kind of invisible to us if we don't really pay attention. So
mm,
the idea was to, in these works, Benzene Float, was to create these massive artworks that are based on the scientific drawings of petrochemicals,
mm,
um, benzene, propane gas, naphthalene, all these different liquid like substances that we use in so many different things on a daily basis. And to create these almost like parade floats out of them to confront people with their presence in a way that they've never looked at them or seen them before.
mm.
And so I really wanted to oppress people, also in terms of color and form. And so it started there and it's been kind of evolving. I think every 6 months I make a new chemical and it's very interesting. But this is where it started.
Mugli, can you go to the next slide?
Mhm.
No, the previous, yeah, this one. Just to give people some sense of the scale of these, especially the earliest versions of these, that on the left, you can see that's the door. So that's roughly human height. So they're like Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade sized
Exactly.
objects. And I actually have never, sadly, had a chance to see these in person, but they're on my wish list. Um,
But if you go to the next slide, you'll see a mini one that's actually in New
Yeah,
York.
and this is one of the ones that's in aluminum and it's in
Yeah.
the at Perrotin.
Aluminum. I mean, it's small. It's really not that big, but it's. I really fell in love with the shape of propane gas. This is
Mm.
propane gas,
You make it look kind of cute.
and I thought, yeah, it looks like a very cute cartoon spaceship or something. So I've been kind of obsessed with propane. I just find it really strange and interesting. And I
Yeah.
always have scientists and chemists coming to me after the show and like, I've never seen, chemistry being visualized in this way, and they always thank me. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Magley, can we go to the next slide? This is kind of a speculative question that's meant to be kind of a bridge between this part of the conversation and the next part of the conversation. But um, the idea of like the circular
Mhm,
or ideas of cycles or rotations or revolutions, um, they extend through a lot of these works. I mean, if you from the kind of like roughly circular form of spectrum to the way in which orbit kind of rotates with like air conditioning, if it happens to be prevalent within the gallery space, because they're kind of levitating in this frictionless um, um, purgatory of sorts. But then also with Nawa and even with some of these the benzene floats. The benzene is this kind of like six pointed ring.
mhm.
So I was wondering if there's any conceptual or philosophical basis for this reference, or is it just does it just happen to be happenstance?
No, no, actually, this is very much related to that. So there is the German scientist who discovered the chemical compounds of benzene, basically, in the mid 19th century. He couldn't figure it out for so long, and then he dozed off in front of his fireplace and had a dream about a snake eating its own tail, and woke up and discovered that the chemical compounds of benzene are a ring with the six atoms around it.
Mm.
And we always think of science as being this very rational, a logical process. But in a way, I mean, I think scientists, very much like artists, have this kind of strange dreams and hallucinations and epiphanies that come out of nowhere. I know, and it was just so interesting to me how this kind of convergence of like science and like human imagination created this chemical that is so important in our world today. And it came from this strange dream about a snake eating its own tail, and I just find it really interesting. So I tried to imagine what his dream was like, that the snake has six atoms around it. And this is kind of a very new work, but I've just been trying to kind of think about these ideas about kind of oil also in dreams and hallucinations. And I think it's very interesting that he thought of the snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, which is a very ancient symbol about rebirth and collapse, In a way, it also mimics the kind of the oil empire that exists in the world today, that it is slowly but surely, inching towards its own demise.
Yeah, I mean, I was just about to say that scholars have noted how oil across the like maybe century and a half that it's been extracted and used has kind of like engendered both profound optimism like early on because of this like surplus energy and all of the wealth and profit that it brought. It was only viewed in a positive light. It literally powered progress and modernity. But eventually, ideas of catastrophe and doom also came to be associated with it. Initially, I mean, or most commonly through kind of like headline grabbing disasters like oil spills like Horizon and Exxon Valdez and things like that. But also, through the slow violence of the climate crisis. Um, but what's interesting also to note historically is that that's actually something that doesn't really happen till the post-war period, and especially the late 60s, which is when environmental activism starts really taking hold in the US. And also in 1973 with the OPEC oil crisis, which is when the Western world first kind of get some sense of scarcity and how it would oil scarcity and how it would transform their lives, and also is around the time when ideas around peak oil and the need to kind of like come up with alternative energy resources starts, like the early inklings of that are happening. But people recognize the fact that, it's not a infinite resource. It is a finite resource. But what's interesting also about this work and like the next few works we're going to discuss, and again, as I think a stream throughout your works, I think it's applicable to everything going back all the way to alien technology, um, is this idea of monstrous beauty. Nagli, if you could, yeah, this is fine. No, 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 this one's good. This idea of monstrous beauty, which I think, encapsulates just duality. So I was wondering if you could talk us through or walk us through, um, the different avatars of monsters that have appeared in your kind of these recent bodies of work. I mean, you already mentioned the Ouroboros, but if you could take us through the next few and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking really also in terms of oil as a kind of poison, right? I mean, it's a monster and a poisonous monster at that. And so I've been fascinated by this concept of poison. This work, Guardian, is based on a plant that I saw in the middle of the desert in the empty quarter, which was just growing there out of nothingness, basically. And then I took pictures of it, I was researching it, and I found out that it's full of this white, milky poison that if you put in your eye, you go blind. And I just thought, it's so horrific to me and almost like a horror film to just think about this plant. As an artist, my ultimate fear is to lose my eyesight, and so I started thinking about the plant so much. It's called it has so many names. The hair of the devil, the gin tree, the apple of Sodom, and yeah, it doesn't need water at all, and it's even the fruit it has is a fake fruit, and it's just full of, an animal would bite into it, and it's just full of air and hair, and it's almost like it has an intention, to kind of lure you and seduce you towards your own demise. So I just find this interesting, and I go back to this topic of the trickster. It's the same for me as the oil itself is almost kind of tricking us to
Mm.
going into these deep, dark valleys that we cannot come back from.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned if you look closely at the image on the right, you can see the sap. And one thing that we were discussing how we may have encountered either this plant or maybe plants that are related. Just they would be growing wild in the Sharjah of my youth in the 70s and 80s. Like we'd be out wandering as children, and you'd come across these plants, and we never realized. But the if you break the leaves, there's this milky sap, which always fascinated me. But I never realized it was so poisonous. But yeah, you can see them kind of like dripping from the leaves, and again, it kind of wonderfully evokes the kind of like sticky, tacky, gooey quality of crude oil. Um, Before we move on from this one, I was wondering if you could speak briefly about the title.
Yes, The Guardian. So I was in the mountains of Alula in Saudi Arabia, and I heard that there was a lot of people going out into the mountains looking for gold. Apparently, there's a lot of gold in the mountains, like naturally. But one of the local people there was like, no, no, if you actually find the gold, you have to put it back because there are guardians around it. He meant jinns and kind of supernatural beings that if you would take the gold from the mountains, you would, they would curse you for the rest of your life. They would
Mm,
haunt you, and you would get sick and you would die. And I thought it was an interesting kind of way of thinking about nature and how, if we disturb it in a certain way, it will haunt us like a ghost. I really think
mm,
of this kind of ecological destruction as almost like a process of haunting, like if like you were talking about monsters, but yeah, it feels like the more we disturb it, the more we will kind of pay the price in the future, right?
mm.
Yeah.
Maglik, we can go to the next one.
So
You want to tell us what it is, what we're seeing? This was
yeah,
a work that was just
yeah.
debuted. It an earlier iteration of it was included in an exhibition that Monira had in Europe a few years ago. But this particular installation shot is taken from its most recent iteration at the Sharjah Biennial earlier, or this past spring.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, Gastromancer is an interesting work. I mean, I started it really, I was researching oil tankers and kind of what they look like and the paint that they're painted with, this reddish kind of burgundy paint. And I came across this crazy, I mean, rabbit hole of stories, which was that this reddish burgundy paint, when it seeps into the water, they found out actually in the 80s, it's called TBT, that it actually causes seashells, these murex seashells, to change their gender. So the females would basically become males and would not be able to procreate. And they couldn't figure out for a long time why these seashell populations were dying. And then they discovered it's actually not the oil or anything, it's the paint on these tankers. So I had this amazing, I mean, it's almost like I made this story up myself. It brought together all of my different kind of fascinations, like the ocean, oil industry, ecological destruction, but also gender, So I imagined a conversation between two Murex seashells that had changed their gender
Mm,
and how they kind of are reacting to kind of their new bodies and their new reality. And the text I used which I adapted from a book, was by Thani El Suwaidi, who is an Emirati writer, and it's called The Diesel, and it's from the early 90s. And of course, it was banned immediately because it was actually about a transsexual character growing up in the UAE in the 20th century, who became a singer and was called The Diesel. And I thought it was such a kind of, I mean, it's a very poetic book. It's very difficult to understand. I mean, it's very short also. But I thought it was such an interesting kind of, almost like futuristic thinking that he had about oil, about gender, about our world, using this very beautiful descriptive kind of poetry about a character like this. And so I adapted this into a conversation. And for me, it was very amazing and interesting and also beautiful that this work was actually shown in the UAE, where this book comes from.
Can you also just, for those of us who didn't get to experience it in person, just um, take us through what the experience of it was?
So basically, you would walk in between the seashells and in this very beautiful kind of circular reddish room. And you would kind of have to go close to them and you can hear them kind of talking to each other. So it's almost like this process of whispering. But the title gastromancer also comes from the idea of gastromancy, which is an ancient I think it's a Greek fortune-telling method of listening to the sounds of your stomach and telling you your fortune. And so it's interesting because also these seashells are called gastropods, which means stomach foot
Mm,
uh, in Greek. So I thought it's an interesting also way of I feel like as an artist, you start to when you try to be so avant-garde, sometimes you're almost like playing the role of fortune teller, right?
mm,
So in a way, we do practice this kind of strange soothsaying, in
mm.
our work, and this is what I feel what I'm doing most of the time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and one other thing that I think it's prudent to point out is that the scale of these objects is quite large. Like your head roughly comes to where the kind of hollow within the shell is. So they're like 1.5 times life size, if not 2 times. It's a quite a monumental installation. Um, I hope some museum picks it up and we get a chance to experience it in person in New York. Um, so just to pick up on this idea, this wonderful idea of artists as fortune tellers in some sense, I kind of wanted to bring us up to perhaps like the most recent or current one of your interests, and also build up on this idea of petro magic. So although we like oil is so closely linked to modernity, it is kind of like one of the quintessential modern materials. Like what we know as of modernity and within even art, modernism would not be possible if it hadn't been for the discovery and then extraction and refinement and production of oil. It's also been responsible for a million wars and ongoing conflict and all of those types of things. But it's not a new material. Maybe its extraction at the scale at which it's been extracted is new, but it's been known and used for millennia for both ritual and medicinal purposes. It was used as bitumen to pave roads. There's ancient records of this all the way back to like Mesopotamia. Um, and it has, as one might expect, like inspired much mystery and mythology. Um, some even speculate that the naturally occurring oil fires across Central Asia may have inspired the emergence of a religion like Zoroastrianism, which centers the worship of fire. Um, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this interest in mythology, a little bit. I'm sorry,
We
I
go to the
completely
next
forgot to.
slide.
Yeah, I completely forgot to discuss this. Um,
Maggie,
yeah,
if we go to the next one, please.
yeah. Sorry, I
Um,
completely forgot about these.
I think
So,
we can skip this for now. We can go
no, no,
to,
no. Why don't we talk about this
well,
and then we
let's
can
go
come back?
here because I don't think we have so much time.
Okay.
Um, so I've been thinking about oil, which is an ancient, substance. It forms over millions and millions of years to basically, to the form that we're using it today. And so I've been thinking about this, ideas of time and like deep time, geological time. And I don't know, at some point, I think it was during the pandemic, I became also very interested in ancient human histories. Also, it's this kind of, it's almost like science fictional escape into kind of a different time. And so I just became obsessed with ancient Egypt at some point. And and yeah, and the first show I did about this was in Beaux-Arts in Brussels last year, which was called The Archaeology of Beasts, which was actually four installations based on this topic. And yeah, and I went to a lot of tombs in Egypt and looked around and really felt also that, the paintings and drawings on the wall, I mean, they're 5,000 years old, but they look like they were painted yesterday. In a way, I also felt like, after everything, even if oil destroys our world, what is left will be art.
Mm,
All that will be left is art. And it really also kind of reignited the kind of idea about why I'm an artist and why I make art in the first place. Um, and so I started making these works. I mean, they're not traditional works about Egypt. They're very strange, distorted, bizarre things. These are, for example, these are called automatown. They're two rotating statues of ancient Egyptian gods, but these are bought from souvenir shops. They sell them for your garden. And all I did was I painted them in this glossy black car paint and put them on rotating platforms. And suddenly they turned into something else. They're very kind of exotic, muscular, almost very sexy kind of gods. And it was shown in this very beautiful setting, which was actually designed 100 years ago. I did not know about this until actually the opening by an architect who was also a Freemason who was obsessed with ancient Egypt and decided to build this room in kind of an ancient Egyptian inspired art architecture. And I thought it was so strange that we did the same thing 100 years apart from each other. But the other works are all kind of, there was a VR work, there's also two video installations. So it's a lot of different things, But yeah, this kind of is also kind of I feel it's a continuation of my practice, but many people think it's also like a very interesting new foray into a different world. Yeah.
Can you reflect a little bit on how it's an extension of your practice? I think maybe the two works that I skipped by mistake were related to that. There is this interesting relationship between the human and the natural, or between the human and the animal, uh, that you were tracing in those works between terrestrial life and extraterrestrial life. And some of these ideas are kind of then following through this very specific, very familiar iconography, but also very specific iconography.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also working, this is kind of a new project I'm working on, which is related to Mars, actually, because there is an area of Mars called Terra Arabia, which is was named that because it has this very magnificent desert that looks like the Arabian desert. And so looking at myself kind of through this alien lens, it just made sense, you know. And I started really kind of researching this, and I discovered that there's this beautiful sand dune there that NASA scientists called the reptilian dune because it looks like the back of a reptile. And so I decided to make this also as a sculpture on the wall. I mean, if you look at it from far away, it just looks like a slash on the wall, but the closer you get to it, it really starts to become three-dimensional. But it's also this idea that we give these human, earthly names to alien landscapes that we don't know anything about, you know, just
Mm,
because something looks similar to something we've seen. Or, I mean, I find it really, really interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
there's a series of works. This was kind of the first one
oh,
that came
okay. Oh, that's
recently.
exciting. I didn't know that. I look
Yeah.
forward to seeing those. Just to give the audience a little bit more context, the UAE for the most part is a fairly small country. I don't know what the current population is, maybe under 10 million, if I had to guess. Um, Yet they have a space program that is directed towards eventually making it to Mars and possibly settling or colonizing Mars. So just to give some sense of the broader context within which some of these interests of Munira's are emerging from. It's not only Elon Musk and other private entities in the West. It is also something that some Gulf countries are also investing a lot of time and money and energy into. Energy both in terms of oil and in terms of mental. Okay, so maybe we can end up. We have a few minutes and we can end up with the work at Central Park. It's located in the southeast corner of Central Park. I think it's called Dorothy Friedman Plaza. Am I
Doris Friedman. Yeah.
Doris Friedman Plaza? Um, and it just went up, and it'll be up for a year. Of course, it's quite obvious that it's, well, not maybe quite obvious, but I once watched a documentary when I was a kid, and it focused on the Egyptian afterlife and scarabs, and it completely scared me. So like I now, when I see the scarab, and especially this like iridescent scarab, it kind of always reminds me of ancient Egypt. But clearly there's a link to the Beaux-Arts exhibition. So if you could talk us through this most recent work um, and some of the ideas that you're exploring.
Yeah, I mean, so going back to Egypt, I was in a tomb underground in Luxor, and I saw this very beautiful painting of a ancient Egyptian god, like a humanoid figure, very muscular and masculine looking, and he had a beetle for a face, and it was just this flat, you know, black image on his face, but the body was very almost three-dimensional, very intricately drawn, and then suddenly there's this very black, almost flat, you know, graphic image on his face, and I didn't understand how. I mean, I even thought it was graffiti, you know, like this thing doesn't belong here somehow.
Mm,
And I even went back to see it three times. I was so, you know, I don't know. It was almost shocking. But everybody told me that it was originally painted like that, you know, 3,500 years ago. But I couldn't just wrap my head around it. And this idea that, you know, At some point in human history, we even revered, insects as gods, that they thought actually the scarab, the beetle, was the dung beetle, actually, was the creator of the universe, and that the beetle would roll the sun across the sky every day. It's one of the first gods ever, I think, in the human psyche.
Yeah.
And I thought it was amazing, like this kind of ecological thinking that we don't have anymore, is
Mm.
this idea of this kind of hierarchy with other creatures and animals that we're at the top of the pyramid and they are all beneath us. It didn't always used to be this way, and so I really wanted to confront people with this idea in a very kind of bold kind of statement. But also, I wanted to make the figure androgynous. It has long hair, but who knows if it's a man or a woman, right? Most people think it's a woman because it has long hair, but that's just because of our impressions of what the length of hair of a person should be. But in my mind, I don't, it's almost like a genderless figure, and that's kind of my idea of divinity is also like that. It doesn't really have a gender. So yeah, that's the work. The work is also traveling to Toronto in 1 year, to the Lausanne Art Trail, which is also a very interesting place. I mean, the idea is that the work is also working kind of it's site specific to both sites, Central Park and also Lausanne. Central Park is also an artificial kind of nature place, a natural place that is created by humans to kind of feel closer to nature in the same way that Lausanne, it's an area that was kind of destroyed by industrialization and factories. And now they've recreated it as this beautiful kind of nature reserve park. They've even recreated the natural kind of river where it used to flow. I mean, it's a huge project. And bioengineered all the native plants and creatures and insects in that place. And I thought it's such an interesting kind of like very laborious artificial exercise to bring us back to nature. But it's also very important, right? So in the same way, the sculpture looks very bizarre and strange and artificial in that place, but it's also this kind of idea of how do we yeah, flatten our relationship with nature a bit more.
Yeah, I mean that effect between flattening and three-dimensionality is quite strong in the work because and I also love the kind of like violence directed against the humanoid figure. Because when you look at it from the side, you realize that like the face has kind of been sliced off by the scarab. And also, people probably got a sense from these images, but the scarab does also change colors depending on which direction you're looking at it from, between like blue to green and purple. Um, yeah, these give you a sense of that.
But the actual beetle in real life also is iridescent,
Yeah,
so
that's actually what I was going to say. It's really interesting that the scarab is an iridescent natural
animal.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
So is pearls, so are oil, so are butterflies. Butterfly wings sometimes have that same like iridescent or dichroic quality. And this again, this idea or this motif of transformation or metamorphosis, which is on one hand divine, natural, but also is so closely associated with the petro, with oil and all things petro, and also like transformation, metamorphosis between the human, the animal, and the divine. It kind of brings us back, like quote unquote, full circle to the idea of oil. So thank you so much for sharing your brilliant works. I will say one little thing really quickly, is that Munira also has produced many really amazing and important video works that aren't featured in the Perrotin show or um, in clearly in the public sculpture at Central Park, but are also really worth checking out if you get a chance. There are some early works that are archival. There are more recent works that are speculative, and that actually build on a lot of these same ideas. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to end there and make sure people understood that your work was kind of like multimediatic.
Thank you, Murtaza.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was such a wonderful conversation. We have a couple of questions from the Q&A. If you marked that you wanted to ask your question, if you could turn on your camera for me, that would be great. The first question is from an anonymous audience member. They first said, it would be wonderful to see the benzene floats in a parade someday. My question is, how do you play with size and scale in your work?
That's a really good question. I mean, a scale, I think, is a very important part of my practice. I think the idea of a scale, I mean, I have works that are like the size of the tip of my finger, and then works that are the size of the side of a building. It's interesting to me to play with this people's sense of scale. I think, I mean, my relationship to the oil industry is that it is so large that I don't understand it. Like I think most people don't actually. It's so beyond kind of the scale of our imagination that it's, we when we're confronted by it, there's this sense of shock. And recently, actually, I made a film in Chittagong in Bangladesh, which is an area where they actually dump used oil tankers, and it's incredible. The scale of these things is I mean, you look at the beginning of the film and it's just like it looks like a boat, but then you realize these tiny specks that are moving are actually people. And I think the scale shocks people mostly with these works. So I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but I think scale is very, very important in my practice. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer, Monira. The next question comes from Babs Reingold. Babs says, I'm drawn to the small pieces on the violet color walls. Does that color choice have anything to do with violet being the color of light at the short wavelength end of the visible spectrum? The color feels theatrical. I noticed not many were presented with dramatic color. Could you speak a bit more about the presentation of the work and the spaces, influence, and interaction with colors on the work?
That's a very good question, especially the purple color is very important to me. In my research of the colors of pearls and oil and iridescence, actually purple came up quite a lot in this the color spectrum. So that's what I used a lot also as a framing device for many of my works. But I discovered years later, actually, that purple is the color of bad luck in the oil industry, because on oil rigs they would have the red alarm for danger, but the purple or magenta alarm was that the oil rig is about to blow, you have to evacuate immediately. So as a kind of superstition in the industry, people don't wear purple things because they don't want to bring about these bad, omens. So I thought that was even more interesting that purple is also yeah, a color of bad luck. I mean it's also the color of empire. Um, it's actually it used to be made out of thousands of the Murex seashells that you saw in Gastromancer. You would need like 20,000 of those and extract the purple color from them to dye like one robe. So it was actually the color of kings and popes. They were the only people who could afford to wear purple. So it was also the color of empire at some point.
I was
Yes.
actually going to ask about that. Was that what drew you to the Murex shell in the first place? Was it this
Yes.
kind of like use of it for power?
Yes, exactly. And I have an early work that was a sculpture of a Murex shell called Empire Dye, Dye.
Oh, right, right, right.
It's the color of the purple dye. Yes.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Are
Mhm.
there other questions? We have some time.
There are a couple more. This next one is from Sammy Mustafa. I'm going to give you a chance to unmute Sammy.
Hello. Um, I think from your discussion that you mentioned, I think like you said, a chemist was very glad that you gave them this representation. But I think um, considering that oils can feel like an identity for some of the people in the Gulf countries, maybe like could you talk about maybe some, and for example, your gastromancer also like, touches upon gender as a topic, which is obviously a very sensitive topic in these areas as well. But could you talk a little bit about maybe some acceptance and opposition that your work has faced, um, just generally considering like, these components that might seem a little sensitive. I know like, there's like Saudi vision, there's like the Oman vision of 2040. Like there's obviously things moving us away from oil, but in general, maybe talk about how these discussions that your work has maybe triggered might have been a bit iffy at times, but
I mean, my work in the Gulf has always been controversial. I think nobody actually wants to talk about these things. It's always like I'm tiptoeing on eggshells, and people are always kind of avoiding the topics that I'm dealing with. But when you create big, colorful forms and oppress people with their presence, they somehow have to accept them. And this is what I've been doing. There is this kind of interplay between beauty and kind of threatening conceptual framework of the work that coming from a society that is like that, I really like playing, with this kind of mental gymnastics that I do that, if you bring beauty with the work, there is this kind of people somehow accept it, even though it hides very dark, very controversial, and very confronting subjects in it. So this is kind of the interplay that I do in my work, I think. And
I
yeah,
also
it's been censored many times. It's fine.
I also do think that the color ends up being a kind of like almost a cloak of camouflage in a
Yes.
way, because it takes these like kind of very complicated, very tricky uh, geopolitical, economic kind of crises that could emerge around oil, and it translates them into very universal experiences, such as color. And another important point for me when I'm thinking about these things is also how a lot of colors that we take for granted as being part of our universe now are actually entirely modern constructions. Like before, you could make synthetic colors, and some of the earliest synthetic colors were actually made from um, the waste products of the coal industry, and then subsequently also petrochemicals. We were limited to colors you could find in nature. And so even all of these colors that you're coating these objects with, they're all kind of like, very modern experiences. So anyway, that was a way of suggesting that maybe some of the critique is also being smuggled in through these kind of very universal or retinal references.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. I also use a lot of humor in my work. And I feel if people think something is funny or comical, they also like accept it very quickly, even if it's about very, taboo subjects like, religion or gender. They just find it really fascinating and fun. And so there is this element of as I go back to the topic of trickery again, I am a trickster myself. So it's very much prevalent in my work.
We have one last question coming from Michael. I'm going to give you a chance to unmute Michael.
Hi. Fascinating talk, really very beautiful work, very interesting. And I was going to ask a question, but it feels kind of silly. But I wanted to just say, while you were talking, I got a call from my pharmaceutical company. They deliver my pharmacy, right? And I told her, I said, I'm listening to this really interesting woman, and she's talking about she has these drills that drill the sky, and they're floating on magnets. And she's like, wow, that's so interesting. And she's like, thank you for sharing it. So I just wanted to say thank you because it was I'm sorry, I'm not asking a question, but it was so cool that, she had that image in her head, and I think it just made her day. And I think it made my day too. So listen, thank you.
Amazing. So happy to hear that. Oh. Petro magic.
Yeah, it's quite a profound experience.
Exactly.
You all, that wraps up the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who asked the question. Thank you to Monira and Murtaza. Thank you, Caitlin, Olivia, and Linka from Ph.D. for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Hank Willis Thomas and Iman Odufu on the event of I Am Many at Jack Shainman Gallery. And as Israel tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monira.
Murtaza.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Murtaza.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, everybody. That's lovely.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
Thank
you.
you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Murtaza. Go see the show, everybody.